He thought she was just furniture with a name tag. The moment the most feared crime boss in the Pacific Northwest leaned toward his enforcer and started cutting her apart in Farsi, assuming she was just another clueless service worker who'd smile, nod, and disappear, he shattered the single most important rule of underestimating people, and never do it out loud. Renata Cruz proved that rule existed for a reason. The Harborview Lounge sat perched on the edge of Seattle's waterfront, like a crown on the city's skyline. Its floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered an unobstructed view of the Puget Sound, where ferry lights blinked lazily through the evening fog. Inside, the lighting was all warm, amber, thick velvet, and the kind of strategic dimness that made people feel rich and anonymous at the same time. For the city's moneyed class, the hedge fund managers, the tech founders, the silent empire builders, it was a cathedral of power, dressed up as a cocktail bar. For Renata, it was a paycheck. She had been working the bar at Harborview for 3 years, which was 2 years and 11 months longer than most of her colleagues lasted under the iron rule of Marcus Beale, the floor director. Marcus was the kind of man who wore a headset even when not actively communicating with anyone, who memorized every guest's preferred drink by their second visit, and who ran the bar floor with the anxiety of a man defusing a bomb nightly. He had hired Renata because she possessed something the other candidates didn't. She did not rattle. Not even a little. 6-foot tech billionaires who snapped their fingers at her got the same even smile as regulars who tipped in quarters. She simply did not buckle. Renata was what fashion editors sometimes gently called full-figured, and what she called absolutely nothing. Because she thought about her body roughly, as often as she thought about the barometric pressure, which was to say, never, unless someone else brought it up first. She wore the Harborview uniform of deep burgundy vest and crisp white button-down with the ease of someone who had decided long ago that she looked exactly right. Her dark curls were pulled back in a thick twist. She wore a single pair of gold stud earrings. She worked efficiently, moved gracefully, and smiled only when she meant it. At 9:45 on a Wednesday evening in November, Marcus appeared at her elbow like a nervous ghost. "They just came in," he said, under his breath, his voice barely audible above the ambient jazz. Renata glanced toward the entrance. The Harborview's heavy glass doors had swung open, and the usual low murmur of conversation across the lounge had quietly, almost imperceptibly, dropped. Not because anyone made an announcement. People simply sensed it the way a field of deer senses a predator before actually seeing it. Dominic Voss had arrived. She had heard the name. Of course, everybody in Seattle had heard the name. Dominic Voss was 41. Georgian-born, raised between Istanbul and Vancouver, and currently the operating head of the Voss Group, which was nominally a private equity firm, and actually something considerably more complicated. His legitimate holdings were extensive: a shipping logistics company, 3 luxury hotel properties, and a stake in a major Pacific Rim import-export consortium. What sat beneath those holdings? The extortion frameworks, the controlled goods moving through his shipping containers. The quiet and permanent resolution of problems was the part that earned him the kind of silence that fell over rooms when he entered them. He was not physically monstrous. That, Renata thought, was the truly unsettling part. He was lean and well-dressed, in a charcoal double-breasted suit, his light brown hair cut close, his posture the loose, unhurried kind that belonged to men who had never once had to rush for anything. He had a face that was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply evaluating. Always. As though every person and every room he entered was a resource to be assessed. He moved to the private section at the far end of the bar, a 4-seat alcove with a frosted glass partition and a view of the water flanked by 2 men in dark suits who said nothing and watched everything. Bar service only tonight, Marcus whispered, pressing his tablet to his chest like a shield. Direct. Professional. Fast. Do not engage. Pour and disappear. Got it, Renata said. She finished the cocktail she was assembling, delivered it to its owner at the far end of the bar, and moved toward the alcove. Dominic Voss was already settled when she arrived, the top button of his jacket undone, one arm resting along the back of his seat. His lieutenant, a square-built man with a shaved head named, as she would later learn, Calder, sat to his right, scanning his phone without looking up. Good evening, Renata said, placing their cocktail napkins precisely. What can I get for you tonight? We have a rotating selection of reserve whiskies tonight. Or I can walk you through the winter cocktail menu. Dominic didn't answer immediately. He looked at the napkins, then at Renata, in a way that felt less like noticing her and more like cataloguing her. He said something to Calder. He said it in Farsi. Renata had grown up between Tehran and Portland. Her mother was Iranian-American, a literature professor who had raised Renata on a combination of Persian poetry, Pacific Northwest coffee culture, and the kind of unsentimental determination that comes from building a life in 2 countries simultaneously. Renata had spent the first 14 years of her life bilingual by necessity, and the next 10 bilingual by pride. She had gone on to study comparative linguistics at the University of Washington, specializing in Middle Eastern languages, and had spent a year in Isfahan on a research fellowship before returning home to help her younger brother through a difficult stretch, a stretch that had not yet ended. She understood every single word Dominic Voss said to Calder. He had said, "This one looks like she wandered in from a diner somewhere. Tell me, do they pay her by the table or by the square foot? Have her bring the Ardbeg and make sure she doesn't knock anything over when she turns around." Calder had laughed a short, snide sound. Renata felt the insult land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread hot and fast. She was acutely aware of Marcus at the far end of the bar, pretending to wipe something down. She was acutely aware of the 2 silent men in suits watching from either side of the alcove. She set down the small leather cocktail menu in her hand. She looked at Dominic Voss, directly, not with deference, not with performance, but with the calm, unwavering focus of someone who has decided that this moment requires complete honesty. And then she responded, in Farsi, clear, unhurried, precise, with the accent of someone who had not learned the language from a textbook but from a household, from a grandmother's kitchen, from arguments and bedtime stories, and the particular music of everyday speech. She said, "A man who needs a foreign language to insult a woman's body is not being clever. He is being a coward. And the saddest kind, one who doesn't even know his cover, is already gone." Calder's phone slipped from between his fingers and hit the marble bar with a hard crack. Dominic Voss went completely still. It was not the stillness of embarrassment. It was the stillness of a man whose entire internal map of a situation had just been redrawn without warning. His eyes, which had been moving with the lazy, proprietary energy of someone surveying his own property, locked onto her face with sudden, total intensity. Neither of them moved for several seconds. Then quietly. In English, "Leave us." His guards didn't question it. Calder gathered his phone from the bar and stepped back. Marcus, who had witnessed approximately 30% of what had just happened and understood none of the Farsi, hovered anxiously near the service station. Renata did not break eye contact with Dominic Voss. "I owe you an apology," Dominic said finally. His accent still present, but lighter than she'd expected. His English unhurried and exact. "That was beneath me." "Yes," Renata said. "It was." She held his gaze for another moment, then turned and walked back to the bar without waiting to be dismissed. The next 5 days were quiet, in the way that pressure systems are quiet. Renata waited for consequences. She lived in a third-floor walk-up in Capitol Hill with 2 houseplants. A second-hand couch she loved unreasonably, and a younger brother named Marco, who crashed on her pull-out every time his life came slightly off its hinges, which was more and more frequently lately. She watched her brother sleep on that pull-out Thursday night and thought about the thing she hadn't told him, that the reason she was working doubles at Harborview 3 times a week wasn't the rent. It was the $34,000 Marco owed to a man named Perrault, who ran a private card circuit out of a building in Sodo, and who had, 2 weeks ago, stopped accepting promises and started making calls. Marco was 23 and reckless in the specific way of people who are brilliant enough to believe their luck will hold. It had not held on Tuesday evening. At 1:15 at night. Renata was counting her drawer in the back room when Marcus appeared in the doorway looking like he'd seen something structural fail. "He's here," Marcus said, "and the bar is empty." She walked out to find the Harborview lounge completely cleared of its usual Tuesday night crowd. Glasses were still half full on tables. A coat had been left on a chair. The bartenders and servers were gone. The only people remaining were 2 men at the door, and Dominic Voss sitting alone at the long bar, a glass of something amber in front of him, in the same posture he'd had 4 days ago, completely at ease. Like the emptiness of the room was simply a preference he had expressed. Marcus was against the wall near the kitchen. His eyes said, "I could not stop this. I am sorry." Renata walked to the bar and stood across from Dominic Voss. "You cleared out the customers," she said. "I needed a conversation without an audience." He replied, "I'm about to clock out." "I know. This won't take long." He reached inside his jacket and placed a slim manila envelope on the bar between them. He didn't push it toward her. He just placed it there. "I want to offer you a contract." Renata looked at the envelope. "You emptied a bar to offer a bartender a contract." "I don't need a bartender," Dominic said. "I need an interpreter and a reader of rooms." He let that sit for a moment. "My organization is currently negotiating a significant trade agreement with a faction based out of Tabriz. Their senior representatives are traditional, cautious, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. My current translators are technically fluent and contextually useless. They're missing something." "What are they missing?" "What you have," he said. "The real thing. The dialect. The subtext. The cultural weight behind the words. I need someone who hears what isn't being said as clearly as what is." He looked at her steadily. "You lived in Iran, Isfahan. Specifically, your fellowship was published." "I read it." Renata's jaw tightened slightly. "You researched me. I was impressed by you," he said. It was not a flattering inflection. It was a factual one. My answer is no. Renata said. I'm a civilian with a linguistics degree and a bar job. I have no interest in your business. Open the envelope before you answer. Dominic said. She didn't want to. She opened it anyway. Inside was not an offer letter. It was a printout photographs. A ledger. Time stamps. Marco, walking out of the Sodo building at 2 inches the morning. Marco's name in a column of numbers. A total, 34. Ling, ling, ling. A note in Perrault's own handwriting past due. Collect by force. Renata's hands did not shake. This was a choice she made deliberately, because she refused to give him that. You have 48 hours before Perrault sends someone to your brother, Dominic said. Not to talk. I can make that problem disappear completely. Marco's debt cleared. Perrault removed from the equation. No further contact. In exchange for one translation job. A single meeting. This Friday. At a location I will provide. You translate. You read the room. You tell me what they're not saying. That's it. And if I say no, Renata asked, then we're two strangers who had an interesting conversation, and Marco handles his own debts. He said it without heat. That made it worse. Renata looked at him across the bar. She hated the architecture of this moment, the way he had constructed it, so that she had exactly one door with a visible exit sign. She hated that he was calm. She hated that she had no good options. She thought of Marco asleep on the pullout, blissfully unaware. His hair still rumpled from the pillow. 23 and reckless, and hers to protect whether she had signed up for it or not. I do this one job, Renata said. Marco's debt is erased completely. You don't contact me again. You don't come back to Harborview. And after Friday, I don't exist to you. Dominic studied her face for a long moment. Agreed, he said. The meeting was held in an industrial complex near the port of Tacoma, 40 minutes south of Seattle, in a driving November rain. The building was enormous and mostly dark, inside a converted cold storage facility with high ceilings and the particular smell of old machinery and seawater. Renata wore a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse. Clothes she had chosen herself because she refused to wear anything provided by him. A detail Dominic had noted without comment. She stood slightly behind his right shoulder as the Tabriz representatives entered the light from the opposite end of the space. Their lead negotiator was a tall man named Farid, elegant, silver-haired, with eyes that moved constantly and smiled rarely. The negotiation began in formal Persian, and Renata translated steadily, her voice low and precise, maintaining the register that the context required. Dominic spoke in English, measured and controlled, his terms non-negotiable in delivery while remaining structurally flexible in form and technique. She noticed that he had clearly refined over many years. 40 minutes in, something shifted. It was subtle. Farid's cadence changed not dramatically, not enough to alarm the untrained ear. But Renata heard it. He had been using a Tehran-educated formal register all evening. Now he slipped, mid-sentence, into a heavily specific coastal dialect, the kind used along the Caspian trade routes, loaded with embedded meaning that existed below the surface of the words themselves. He was no longer speaking to Dominic. He was speaking to someone she couldn't see. The words he chose, translated at their surface level, discussed timeline flexibility and good faith gestures. but in the dialect's deeper register, in the specific idioms she had studied for her fellowship. Documented, written about. They meant something else, entirely. She leaned toward Dominic's ear. He just switched dialects. She said, barely above a whisper, "He told someone above us to seal the exits. This isn't a negotiation. It's a setup. They're going to take the meeting point by force." Dominic did not look up at the catwalks. He did not flinch. "Tell him," Dominic said in English, very quietly, "that we appreciate his hospitality and that we'll be concluding the meeting early." Before she could translate it, every light in the building went out simultaneously. The next 4 minutes were the longest of Renata's life. She was pulled low and fast behind a steel storage unit by a grip she didn't have time to resist. And then everything was noise. The hard, deafening percussion of gunfire. The shout of voices she couldn't locate. The shatter of something industrial overhead. She pressed her back against cold metal and tried to breathe through it, counting the sounds the way her mother had taught her to count, beats in difficult music not to feel less afraid, but to stay inside herself while the world became unrecognizable. Dominic appeared through the dark, dropping beside her. There was blood on his sleeve, not his. She would discover later. "Can you run?" he said. "Yes. 40 yards. Straight line. I need 30 seconds. She didn't ask what the 30 seconds were for. "Go on my count," he said. She went on his count. She ran hard and did not look back. And 32 seconds later, she hit a fire exit door with both hands and fell through it into the cold, wet night. And he came through 8 seconds after that. And then they were in a moving vehicle, and the building was behind them, and the city lights of Tacoma were smearing past the rain-dark windows. The safe house was a top-floor apartment in a building in First Hill, high enough to see the Space Needle's lit crown above the tree line. It was warm inside. Someone had made coffee. Renata sat on a grey sofa, with a wool blanket around her shoulders, and stared at the steam rising from her cup. Dominic stood by the window. He had changed his shirt. He held a glass of whiskey, but wasn't drinking it. "Your brother's debt was paid an hour ago," he said. "Pero has been dealt with. Marco is safe." Renata nodded. She had no words yet. "That was okay. You caught what none of my people would have caught," Dominic said. "Farid has run that play 3 times in the last 2 years. We had no record of the dialect code. You decoded it in real time." He paused. "You saved my life tonight, Renata." She looked at him across the room. "I held up my end," she said. "So we're done." He walked to the low table between them and placed an envelope beside her coffee cup. Inside, she already knew, would be something that confirmed Marco's debt was cleared. She didn't pick it up yet. "We're done," Dominic agreed. She stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. She reached for the envelope. She was about to say something efficient and final, something that would close this chapter cleanly and completely, when she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not evaluation. Not strategy. Something quieter and considerably more complicated. "You're free to go," he said. His voice was even. His eyes said something else entirely. "I want to be clear about that. No conditions. No leverage. You walk out that door, and this entire chapter of your life disappears." Renata held his gaze. "But I want to ask you something," he continued. "And I want to ask it as a person, not a transaction. Because somewhere between the bar and the gunfire, I stopped thinking of this as a business problem. Don't, Renata said. You are the most linguistically fluent, situationally intelligent, and genuinely unfrightened person I have met in 15 years of working with people whose entire professional identity is built around those qualities, Dominic said. And you did it in a bar apron and a pair of sensible shoes. I want you to stay. In what capacity? Renata said flatly. In any capacity you name. He said. That's a new sentence for me. I'm aware of that. Renata looked at him for a long time. She looked at the window behind him, at the city lights reflected in the wet glass, at the Space Needle standing up out of the skyline like a question mark. She thought about the pull-out couch and the 2 house plants and the bar job and the particular loneliness of being the most capable person in every room and having absolutely no one notice. She thought about tonight, about the dialect shift she had caught in the dark, about the 32 seconds, to about the way he had said, "Can you run?" instead of "run." She thought, this is not a safe decision. She picked up the envelope. She put it in her jacket pocket. "I'll think about it," she said. It was not a yes. It was not a no. It was the most honest thing she had said all night, and they both knew it. She walked toward the door. She heard him exhale behind her one quiet, unguarded breath, and she did not turn around. But she did not quite close the door all the way either. And in the morning, when she thought about it again, in the early light of her Capitol Hill apartment, Marco safe and asleep for the first time in months on the pull-out couch behind her, she found, to her own considerable irritation, that she was still thinking about it.